In this lesson, we'll learn how to write model specs using RSpec. Many objects in a system can qualify as a model in terms of design and the domain of a system. With RSpec, when we use the term model for a type of test, we're specifically talking about those that inherit from active record and are tied to the database. These model specs are defined by the type model option and are generally located inside of the spec/models directory. First, we'll establish a rudimentary model to write our specs against. I'm using context to separate the different concepts I'll be testing, like validations, attributes, scopes, and instance methods. This isn't required, but structuring similarly via context or describe can help keep a complex model spec easy to maintain over time. Let's start by testing the validations. Testing validations is pretty straightforward. We want to make sure we can create a valid model, and we want to make sure we know when a model is invalid. There are a lot of ways to do this, and the most straightforward is to just literally set up instances of the model to pass or fail validation. We only have one validation on our employee model for the presence of the pay status attribute. So we can ensure a valid model by just setting up an employee with a value for pay status and an invalid model by setting up an employee without a pay status. This is where I'm doing the act portion of the spec. I'm calling valid on the model and pulling out the error messages from it. For a valid model, I'd expect those to be true and for the number of errors to be 0. For an invalid model, I can expect the opposite. Unfortunately, our test wouldn't pass because our employee is not valid. In Rails version 5 and above, a belongs to association sets a hidden validation check to ensure that the associated record exists and is in the database. So in order to be valid, our employee needs to have a company it is associated to and that is present in the database. So we'll have to create a company prior to checking for validity and pass its ID to the employee. Models can have a lot of attributes tied to the database columns. These are important public interfaces into a model, and other objects can depend on them being there. A simple way to get coverage of the attributes on your model is to test the output of the attribute names method, which is a part of all active record models. It returns a list of all attribute names as strings. We can then use contain exactly to make sure the output of attribute names matches exactly what we expect that model to have. If someone were to later drop a database column from that model or rename it, this test would fail and would need to be updated to prevent an accidental column drop. Contain exactly is a matcher that ensures the list items it is provided matches exactly with the actual list. The order is unimportant for this matcher, just that both lists have the same items in them, regardless of position. Next, we'll write our scope test. Scopes are all about querying the database. So far, we've been using mostly instances of employee that haven't actually been persisted to the database. To effectively test a scope, we want to set up data in the database and actually query against it. Ideally, we should set up employees in the database that will be included in our query, but also employees that should not be returned by our scope. This will allow us to ensure the effectiveness of the scope better. So let's create a few employees. A before block is useful for this kind of setup. We'll set up 2 employees that should match the scope and 2 employees that should not. Then assert on the result count and another assertion on the values of some of the results. This is where we'll test the methods we've added to instances of models. Our employee model has a single instance method, the full name method, which brings together the first and last name of the employee. We can set up an instance of the employee with specific first and last names, and then ensure the full name method returns the result we expect. Instance methods are often prefixed with the hash symbol in describe blocks, while class methods are prefixed with the period. As you can see with our active salary test for our scope, which is a method we call on the class. This is a convention and not a hard rule. This test is pretty straightforward, since we control all the inputs and the output is pretty simple. Even for complex instance methods that return data, the basic concept still applies. We want to set the data up so that we can make expectations about the output of the instance method. Use the arrange, act, and assert to complete the model spec.